Hello and welcome back to RPG PhD. I'm Dr. Ben. Today's lecture gets at something fundamental about what separates a session people remember from a session people merely attended. We're talking about dramatic tension curves and rhythmic pacing, specifically how to use both to take intentional control of your session's narrative flow. The principles we're working with today come from theatrical theory, narrative science, and psychology. People have been studying why certain experiences grip us and others don't for a very long time, and that research has real practical applications behind the Game Master screen. So, let's get into it. Let's start by building a shared vocabulary, because tension is one of those words that gets thrown around a lot in Game Master advice without anyone stopping to define it precisely. Tension is the felt experience of unresolved expectation. It lives in the gap between what players want and what they have, between what they fear and what hasn't happened yet. It's the space between a question being asked and a question being answered. Danger and conflict can create it, but neither is tension itself, and plenty of dangerous, conflict-filled sessions produced almost none of it, because the outcomes feel inevitable. Tension requires genuine uncertainty and requires the possibility that things could go either way, and that the difference between those two outcomes actually matters to the people at the table. That gap, that space of unresolved possibility, is one really important engine of engagement. In 1863, a German playwright named Gustav Freytag mapped dramatic structure as a pyramid. Exposition at the base, rising action, climbing toward a climax at the peak, then falling action descending to resolution. You've seen this diagram. Every high school English class has drawn it on a whiteboard at some point. Freytag was describing something real, but his model has a problem for our purposes, and it's a significant one. It assumes a single author controlling a single linear narrative. That's a play or a novel. That is emphatically not a tabletop role-playing game session where 5 people at the table can collectively detonate your carefully planned Act 2 in the first 40 minutes because someone had an idea. So Freytag's pyramid is our starting point rather than our destination. What I want you to picture instead is something more flexible. Imagine a simple graph. The horizontal axis is time measured in scenes. The vertical axis is emotional intensity, running from 0 at the bottom to 10 at the top. 0 is complete rest. Players are in town, recovering, having a quiet conversation over a fire. 10 is maximum stakes. Someone is about to die. A terrible choice has to be made. The room has gone completely silent. Plot your session on that graph and it makes a shape, a line that rises and falls, peaks and valleys across the runtime of your evening. That shape is what we're designing today. Psychologists Barbara Fredrickson and Daniel Kahneman identified something they called the peak-end rule. Through extensive research, they found that people don't judge an experience by its average quality. Memory reconstructs the whole from 2 specific moments: the most emotionally intense point, and how it ended. Everything in between carries far less weight than we assume it does. Everything in between is largely reconstructed from those 2 anchors. So think about what that means for your sessions. A 3-hour session with one genuinely devastating, perfectly placed climax and a resonant ending will have more of a chance of being remembered as a great session. A 3-hour session of consistent, competent, medium-intensity encounters might be remembered as fine. Not bad, just fine. Narrative theorist Roland Barthes, in his analysis of how stories generate engagement, identified 5 narrative codes operating simultaneously in any text. 2 of them are directly useful here. The hermeneutic code, the engine of suspense built from an open question the reader, or in our case the player, desperately wants answered, and the proeretic code, the code of actions, where things happen and their happening generates forward momentum through the story. Barthes was working as a literary theorist, but the pattern he identified connects directly to something behavioral economist George Loewenstein documented empirically in 1994. Lowenstein described curiosity as a state of cognitive deprivation, arising from the gap between what we know and what we want to know. That gap generates genuine discomfort, and the discomfort motivates resolution. Research since then has found that curiosity activates the same dopamine pathways in the brain that respond to food and other biological rewards. A scene that opens a question and delays its answer is pulling on a drive that runs considerably deeper than narrative convention. Hitchcock understood this intuitively long before the neuroscience caught up. He drew a distinction between surprise and suspense that is worth quoting almost exactly. Surprise is a bomb under the table explodes without warning, and you get 15 seconds of shock. And suspense is the audience knows the bomb is there, the characters don't, and the conversation continues. And you get 15 minutes of unbearable tension from the same bomb. The bomb is Lowenstein's information gap made physical. The conversation that continues over it is the delay that transforms a single shock into sustained, biological, almost involuntary engagement. Your attention curve is a map of how you manage those questions across a session. When you ask them, how long you hold them open, when you answer them, and crucially, how you make sure a new question opens the moment an old one closes. A session that closes every question cleanly and opens no new ones can go flat. A session that opens questions and never answers them can become frustrating. The craft is in the rhythm between those two states. Before we start building good tension curves, we need to be honest about what breaks them, because the two most common session pacing failures are both completely understandable, both incredibly common, and have both solid theoretical explanations for why they don't work. The first is the flatline. A flatline session lives between a 4 and a 6 on the intensity scale for its entire runtime. Encounters happen, but none of them feel urgent. NPCs appear, but none feel genuinely threatening. Revelations land, but none land very hard. Players are present and engaged in a surface sense, but they're not invested. The session is competent, and 2 weeks later, nobody can quite remember what happened. This is the most common pacing failure that I see, and it comes from a completely human place. Game masters want their players to have fun, so sometimes they smooth off the rough edges. They soften danger to avoid frustration. They resolve conflict quickly to keep things moving. They avoid the scenes that might make players uncomfortable because discomfort can feel like failure at some tables. The result is a session where nothing genuinely hurts, and as a direct consequence, nothing genuinely soars. Csikszentmihalyi's flow model gives us a useful frame for why this fails. He described optimal engagement as a channel balance between two states. Boredom, which occurs when challenge falls below the player's skill and investment level, and anxiety, which occurs when it exceeds it. The flatline session sits permanently in boredom territory. Players are capable of more emotional engagement than the session is asking of them, so their minds begin to wander. The caring is there. The session just has nowhere to put it. There's also something Barth would recognize here. A flatline session is one where the hermeneutic code never fully activates. Questions are asked softly and answered quickly. Nothing stays open long enough to generate genuine suspense. The engine of engagement never turns over. The second is the red line. The red line session is the flatline's mirror image, and it's equally destructive in a less obvious way. Everything is urgent. Every NPC is a potential threat. Every room might be an ambush. Stakes are always maximum. The game master has absorbed the advice that tension is good and has applied it everywhere all the time without relief. What happens to players in a red line session? They go numb. It's basic physiology. Walter Cannon's foundational research on the fight or flight response identified how the sympathetic nervous system mobilizes the body under threat. Adrenaline surges, arousal spikes, the system prepares for action. What Cannon also understood is that this response is designed for acute threat rather than sustained exposure. Later stress physiology research confirmed what follows when the signal runs continuously. The nervous system habituates. It stops responding to the threat because the threat has become ambient noise. This might be why players start making jokes during your 3-hour climax. It's their nervous systems calling for an exhale you haven't given them all evening. They're self-regulating because the session isn't doing it for them. The Yerkes-Dodson framework, developed in 1908, gives us a useful model for why this matters for performance. Moderate arousal produces peak cognitive and emotional engagement. Push past that point and performance degrades. A relationship researchers have since observed across a wide range of tasks and contexts. Flat lines fail on one side of that curve, red lines fail on the other. Here's the cruelest part of the red line problem. Your actual climax, the moment you've built toward, the scene that should be the emotional peak of the evening, arrives when players have nothing left. They've been spending emotional bandwidth since sessions start. By the time you need them fully present, fully invested, and fully feeling it, the tank is empty. The climax was well designed. It was just positioned wrong, and positioning is everything. Kahneman's peak-in rule cuts both ways. Yes, a genuine peak moment defines the session's memory, but if the entire session is at peak intensity, there is no peak. There's just a flat line at the top of the scale instead of the middle. So we've established that sessions have a shape, and we've named 2 ways that shape goes wrong. Now let's look at a way that might feel better at the table. Here is the principle that ties everything together, and I want you to sit with it before we complicate it at all. Sessions breathe. That's the whole model. Sessions inhale, tension rises, and they exhale, tension releases. Your job as a game master is to control the breath, know when to push and when to pull back. The exhale is doing real work every moment it's present because without it, the next inhale has nowhere to build from. This comes from a place deeper than role-playing game theory. Leonard Mayer, in his landmark work, Emotion and Meaning in Music, argued that musical emotion is generated almost entirely by the creation and violation of expectations. Tension in music arises when an expected resolution is delayed. Release comes when it finally arrives. The emotional power of a piece of music lives in the relationship between its tension and its resolution, and crucially, in the timing of that relationship. Psychologist David Huron built on Mayer's work and identified what he called the ITPRA cycle: imagination, tension, prediction, reaction, appraisal. The full psychological arc of an anticipated event. Before an outcome arrives, we imagine possible futures and feel tension as uncertainty builds. Once it arrives, we experience an immediate response to whether our prediction was accurate, then a fast instinctive reaction to the outcome itself, and finally a slower appraisal of what it meant. 2 phases, everything before the moment of resolution and everything after it. The heartbeat model is how you design it intentionally, and it works on 2 layers. Layer 1 is the beat cycle. Nearly every scene in your session moves through 4 phases. You can think of them as action, consequence, reflection, and anticipation. Action is the scene happening, the fight, the negotiation, the revelation, the discovery. Something occurs. This is the part game masters are generally good at because it's the most visible part. It's the content. Consequence is the immediate aftermath. What changed? What was lost or gained? Who is different now than they were before the scene began? This phase is critical, and it's one that some game masters skip, usually due to wanting to keep momentum moving. The scene ends and the instinct is to cut immediately to the next thing. But resist that instinct. The consequence phase is where the action can acquire meaning. Reflection is the emotional processing beat. This is where characters, and by extension players, respond to what just happened. A brief conversation around a body, a moment of silence after a revelation, a character staring at their hands after a difficult choice. This doesn't need to be long. 30 seconds of genuine emotional space does more work than 5 minutes of filler dialogue. What you're doing in the reflection phase is inviting players to feel something rather than just react to something. Stanislavski, the great theatrical director, built his entire rehearsal method around what he called units and objectives, the idea that every beat of a scene has an intention, and a scene ends when that intention is achieved or blocked. The reflection phase is Stanislavski's denouement for the individual scene. It completes the unit. It tells the player's brains that this experience is finished and processed before the next one begins. Anticipation is the transition forward, a hint, a threat, an unanswered question, a door that just opened, an NPC's parting warning. This is your inhale. Tension begins to build again. The next scene has been seeded before it starts. When you cycle through all 4 phases before cutting to the next scene, players can experience the session as a sequence of complete emotional events rather than a list of things that occurred. The session gains texture because the cycle gave them somewhere to put their feelings. Layer 2, scene types as instruments. The beat cycle governs how individual scenes breathe. This second layer governs how scenes relate to each other, and it's where the compositional thinking really opens up. Think of your scene types as instruments in an orchestra. You might have combat, roleplay, exploration, mystery, and rest. Each has a natural tension range. Combat might sit between a 6 and a 9. It's physically urgent, mechanically immediate, with stakes that are visible and legible. Even when the party is unlikely to lose, combat communicates danger through its structure. Roleplay might range from a 2 to an 8 depending on its emotional content. A casual tavern scene is a 2. A confrontation with a dying mentor is an 8. The range is wide, which makes roleplay your most versatile instrument. Exploration tends maybe toward a 3 to 5. Curiosity and discovery, the pleasure of the unknown, but without the immediate pressure of physical danger. It's a clarinet to combat's brass section, lighter, more agile, capable of carrying melody without demanding attention. Mystery is interesting because it builds. It might enter a scene at a 3 and creep toward a 7 as clues accumulate and implications sharpen. Mystery is the instrument that rewards patience. It needs room to develop. Rest, genuine rest, true downtime, lives at a 0 to 2. Players recovering, characters in safety, the world going quiet for a moment. This is the instrument some game masters are afraid to play. So here's the compositional principle that binds all of this together. You don't play the same instrument for the entire session. The power of an orchestra comes from the relationship between its instruments, the quiet passage that makes the brass entry devastating, the held note before the crescendo that gives it space to land, the silence, actual silence, that makes what follows it feel enormous. Your session works the same way. A combat encounter that arrives after 30 minutes of building mystery hits differently than a combat encounter in the opening 5 minutes. A quiet roleplay scene after a brutal fight might do more emotional work than a post-combat narration. An unhurried exploration sequence between 2 major confrontations is structural preparation. It's the valley that makes the next peak possible. This is Meyer's principle applied directly to session design. The emotional power of your peak is relational. It comes from what surrounds them. You are designing scenes, yes, and you are equally designing the spaces between them. You are designing contrast, and contrast, handled with intention, is a fantastic tool for the game master. One final note on rest specifically, because it's the instrument that some GMs most consistently underuse. Genuine rest beats, moments where nothing is threatening, where players can breathe and characters can exist without urgency, are active structural components doing essential work. They are widening the valley. And as we have established earlier, the depth of your valley directly determines the height your next peak can reach. When I studied theatrical lighting design, one thing that I found really interesting was a technique we used for climactic moments on stage. So let's say you needed a light cue to hit as bright as possible at the peak of a scene. Maximum intensity, full power, the moment lands and the audience feels it. Simple enough. Except what do you do when the lights are already at full? You've been building all scene and now you're at 100%. There's nowhere to go. The solution is counterintuitive, but you start by dropping the intensity to say 80%, but so gradually that nobody in the audience consciously registers it. A few percent over 30 seconds. Slow enough that it isn't noticeable, and then at the climactic moment, you push the lights back to full. The audience experiences the lights getting brighter than they appeared to be before, but they didn't. They just returned to where they already were. But the brief, imperceptible dip gave their eyes a new baseline, and from that baseline, full power reads as something even brighter than what was experienced earlier. Your sessions work the same way. The valley is the slow dim, the peak is the return to full. Don't fill your rest beats, protect them. Let them be genuinely low. Let your players feel safe for a moment. So, based on the theorists that we have examined so far, let's build a practical and malleable session shape. We will start with the 3-peak session structure. So, I want to introduce a default architecture for a standard 3 to 4 hour session. I want to be clear up front, this is a skeleton. This is not a formula. Its purpose is to give you a starting shape you can bend, compress, or expand based on what your specific session needs. It's not meant to be a rigid prescription. Some sessions want 2 peaks, some want 4. The point is that you're making that decision deliberately rather than discovering the shape of your session after the fact. So here's the skeleton. Peak 1, the question. This lands within the first 30 minutes and sits around a 6 or 7 on the intensity scale. Its job is singular. Establish why today matters. This session right now. What is the question this session is going to answer? And why do the players need to care about that question? This peak can be a revelation that recontextualizes everything the players thought they knew. An arrival that changes the political landscape of the scene. An NPC in crisis who needs help immediately. An emergency that overrides whatever the players plan to do. The content is flexible. The function is fixed. Create urgent, legible stakes quickly and leave a thread of unresolved consequence that players can pull on. Pacing-wise, question peak should be punchy. Escalate fast, cut before the scene overstays. You're trying to open a question that demands an answer. Peak 2, a complication. This lands roughly at the session's midpoint and escalates to around a 7 or 8. The complication's job is to take whatever progress players made in the first half and make it cost something. A plan that was working hits an obstacle. An ally is revealed to be compromised or simply wrong. A choice is forced that players would rather not make. The world pushes back. The complication is where your session earns some emotional weight, because it's where consequences become personal. The first peak established stakes. The complication makes those stakes specific to the player's decisions. It says, you've made choices, and those choices had a shape. And here is what that shape looks like now. Between peak 2 and 3, you might want your deepest valley. Your genuine exhale, an exploration sequence, a roleplay beat, a moment of rest where the immediate pressure has lifted and players can reflect on what just happened and anticipate what might be coming. This valley is structural preparation. It's the silence before the crescendo. Protect it with the same intentionality you bring to your peaks. Peak 3 is the crescendo, your session-ending crescendo, landing in the final 30 to 45 minutes at a 9 or, when everything has aligned, a 10. This is the payoff for every tension beat that preceded it, and it carries one essential design requirement. It must be earned. Kahneman's peak end rule tells us this is the moment that will define how players remember the entire session. That everything else is context for this, which means peak 3 needs to arrive when players are emotionally present and personally invested in the outcome. Earned climaxes are specific. They resolve questions this party opened about these characters in this story. They cost something real, and they leave players feeling the particular exhaustion of having genuinely mattered. After peak 3, you want a brief denouement. The consequence and reflection phases of the beat cycle applied to the session as a whole. Let the table process before you call time. So let's talk about building your map. Here's the practical process. Before your next session, take a few minutes and do this. Draw the graph. Horizontal axis, scenes roughly estimated. Vertical axis, intensity 0 to 10, mark your 3 peaks. Put your hook in the first quarter, put your complication at the midpoint. Put your climax in the final quarter. Now, draw your valleys. Between the hook and your opening, mark 1 or 2. The session needs to establish before it escalates. Between peak 2 and peak 3, draw your deepest valley, a genuine 0 or 1, your protected rest beat. A brief mid-level rise, a 4 or 5 as tension builds toward the climax. Look at the shape you've drawn. That's your session's emotional architecture. It doesn't tell you what happens. It tells you what order things happen in and how much space to give each thing. When players deviate, and they will, you're not trying to force them back onto the line, you're trying to restore the shape. If the hook landed too hard and you're at an 8 by minute 20, you need a valley faster than planned. If the complication deflated and you're at a 4 when you need a 7, you have a mechanical or narrative lever to pull. The map is your reference. The session is always live. That's the practice. It takes 5 minutes in prep and it changes the entire felt experience of your session. So let's talk about endings. We're going to look at resolution versus cliffhanger. How you end a session is, per Kahneman, half of how that session will be remembered. So this deserves some precise thinking. A resolution ending completes the session's central question. Players receive the consequence and reflection beats in full. There is closure of tonight's specific question. These endings feel satisfying and complete. They honor the work the players did. They send people home with a sense of accomplishment rather than of urgency. So use resolution endings when players are emotionally tired, when the session has been particularly heavy or high stakes, when a character has accomplished something significant that deserves to land fully before the next thing begins, when you want to create a genuine chapter break in the campaign's rhythm. A cliffhanger ending cuts at or immediately after a moment of peak tension or major revelation. It deliberately withholds the reflection phase. It creates a sensation of incompleteness that makes players think about your campaign between sessions. Use cliffhanger endings when you want to maintain campaign momentum across a sequence of sessions. When you've just dropped a revelation that needs time to breathe before it can be processed at the table. When you want the next session to open with immediate urgency rather than requiring a new question to establish the stakes. One practical note on cliffhangers, they work on a per-campaign budget. A cliffhanger every session might train players to expect incompleteness, and they might stop feeling the urgency. 2 or 3 across a campaign arc placed at genuinely significant moments hit with real force. Remember, contrast is key. So let's talk about reading the room. Everything we've built so far lives in your prep notes, the tension map, the peak placements, the protected valleys, the deliberate sequencing of scene types. That work is real and of course it matters. Do it. And then your players sit down and the session goes live and none of it survives contact with the table exactly as written. This is not a problem. This is the nature of the form. Tabletop role-playing games are not theater where the script is fixed and the director's job is fidelity to the text. They're closer to jazz. You know the chord changes, you know the key, you have a structure you've internalized deeply enough to depart from it, and then you play with and for the people in the room. The map is your preparation. Real-time reading is your performance. So this section is about the live craft, how to read what's actually happening at your table, moment to moment, and how to adjust your attention curve in real time without breaking the fiction or losing the room. The table is a feedback system. Your players are communicating with you constantly during a session, sometimes with words, but just as often with their bodies, their energy, their engagement patterns. Learning to read those signals is one of the highest level game master skills there is, and it should be discussed more explicitly. So here's one description of what genuine engagement might look like. Players lean forward. They make eye contact with each other and with you. They interrupt each other with plans, reactions, theories because they're excited. They ask questions that push the fiction forward. When you describe something, they respond before you finish describing it. The table has a collective movement that you can feel as much as see. So here's what a flatline might look like in the room. Players lean back, phones appear, side conversations emerge that have nothing to do with the session. Rules questions surface that feel less like genuine confusion and more like bids for engagement. They want something to engage with and have run out of content that's gripping them in the game. Descriptions land in silence. Players wait to be told what to do rather than generating their own direction. Or maybe what a red line looks like in the room. And this one is a little subtler. Players start deflecting. Jokes arrive at moments that don't call for jokes. Someone proposes an absurd solution to a serious problem, and the table laughs harder than the joke warrants. Characters do things that are slightly out of character, slightly too casual, slightly unserious. That last pattern is the one that catches some game masters off guard most because it often looks like the players are having fun. And in one sense, they are. Laughter is a genuine pleasure. But it can also be a pressure valve. When the nervous system has been running hot for too long, humor is one way people self-regulate. The joke might be a sign that tension has been working without relief for too long, and the table is taking the exhale that you didn't give them. When you read the room and recognize that the session shape needs correcting, here are 3 possible adjustments. All of them are nearly invisible to players when executed well. They are completely diegetic, and they don't require you to step outside the fiction. Accelerate. Use this when the table is flat, when engagement has dropped, when energy is low, when players are waiting rather than acting. Acceleration means cut your current scene shorter than planned and move to the next escalation faster. Raise the stakes of whatever is currently happening by introducing an immediate consequence or complication. Add a time pressure that wasn't there before. Something is coming, something is about to change, and the players have less runway than they thought. Bring in an NPC with urgent information or a direct threat. Make something that was background become foreground. The key to acceleration is that it never feels like a gear shift. You're simply letting the next thing arrive sooner. A well-placed NPC interruption is a narrative acceleration and a completely natural story event simultaneously. A sudden complication that raises stakes is a pacing correction and good fiction simultaneously. Players experience the session getting more interesting. Hold. Use this when you've just hit a peak and the table needs to process before moving on. When something significant just happened and you can feel that players have feelings about it that haven't been expressed yet. When the reflection phase of your beat cycle is being rushed by the session's momentum and you need to slow down and let it breathe. Holding means linger in the current moment. Describe slowly and with more sensory detail than usual. Ask players what their characters are thinking or feeling, which is an invitation to the reflection phase rather than a demand for action. Let silence exist at the table without immediately filling it. Sit with the aftermath of what just happened, rather than cutting away from it. The instinct against holding is strong because silence can feel like empty space. A quiet table feels like a dead table. But there is a qualitative difference between the silence of disengagement, which is flat and slightly restless, and the silence of genuine emotional processing, which has weight and presence. Learn to distinguish them. The second kind of silence is some of the most valuable time in your session. Pivot. Use this when neither accelerating nor holding is working, when the session has lost its structural footing entirely, when a scene is run past its natural end and is consuming time without generating tension, when players are stuck in a way that isn't dramatically productive, when you need a structural reset. A pivot introduces a new element that reorients the scene or transitions the session into new territory. A new NPC arrives with information that changes the situation. An environmental event shifts the physical or emotional context. A revelation reframes what the players thought they were doing. A threat that was distant becomes immediate. The pivot is your emergency tool. And like all emergency tools, it works best when it doesn't look like an emergency. The NPC who arrives at exactly the right moment should feel like the story delivering what it always intended to deliver, rather than a game master throwing a lifeline. This is where your prep investments pay off. The more texture and logic your world has, the more naturally a pivot can arrive from within the fiction rather than appearing to be imposed on it. Stanislavski called this kind of intervention an offered circumstance, a new given that actors must respond to as if it were always part of the scene. Your pivot is an offered circumstance. When it works, players experience the world being alive and responsive. Now let's talk about some of the limits of these frameworks. These frameworks are tools, and tools, of course, can be misapplied. The tension map, the 3-peak structure, the beat cycle, all that comes from disciplines built around audiences, around people receiving a designed experience. And tabletop role-playing games are only partly that. The other part is something those disciplines don't fully account for: genuine collaborative authorship. Your players are not an audience. They are co-creators. And by co-creators, I mean the players are creating story arcs within the fiction through their characters' actions in the world. And there is a version of applying these frameworks that forgets that distinction entirely. If you run your session with one eye permanently on the tension graph, chasing your planned peaks, protecting your valleys, managing your players' emotional states, like a theme park engineer managing queue psychology, you might produce sessions that are technically well-shaped and experientially hollow. Players feel the difference between a game master who is present with them and a game master who is executing a design at them. Kahneman can tell you what makes an experience memorable. He cannot tell you what makes it meaningful. Those are related but separate questions. Flow research is genuinely powerful, and it is also research conducted largely on individuals in solitary pursuits. The social and collaborative dimensions of flow at a table of 5 people with different investment levels, different emotional states, and different ideas about what a good session looks like are considerably messier than the model suggests. Some nights the table needs something the tension curve cannot provide. Someone had a terrible day. 2 players are in a weird place with each other. The campaign has hit a point that is personally resonant for someone in a way that you didn't anticipate. On those nights, the most important game master's skill is putting the framework down and just being present with the people in the room. Freytag's pyramid was designed for tragedy. His model privileges catharsis, which is an Aristotelian concept rooted in the idea that audiences need emotional purging. Your players may want something else entirely. Resolution, yes. Catharsis, sometimes. But also wonder, absurdity, intimacy, shared laughter, the particular pleasure of a plan coming together cleanly. Not every session needs to move through darkness to earn its peaks. The framework can become a bias toward dramatic suffering if you apply it without asking whether suffering is what your table actually needs right now. And finally, a word about the Kahneman caveat specifically. The peak end rule is quite a robust finding in behavioral economics, and it describes how people remember experiences after the fact. It doesn't describe what makes an experience worth having in the moment. There is a risk in optimizing sessions for memorability at the expense of the quieter, less peak-shaped pleasures that make a long campaign feel like a life shared rather than a series of highlight reels. Some of the most important sessions in a campaign won't have a 10 on the tension scale. They will have a conversation that mattered, a character moment that landed, a decision that will echo forward. Those sessions may not score well on the peak end rule. They are essential anyway. So use these frameworks as a starting point for thinking about shape and feel. Hold them loosely enough that the actual people at your table can always take precedence over the theory. So now let's look at a field guide for game masters. So we've covered a lot of ground today: theory, models, mechanics, real-time craft. But before we close, I want to give you something that you can take to your prep table tonight: a practical field guide, a step-by-step, the actual process of applying everything we've discussed to a real session. Step 1 is draw the map. Before anything else, before you write a single encounter or plan a single NPC interaction, open a blank page and draw the graph. Horizontal axis scenes, vertical axis intensity 0 to 10. It takes 60 seconds and it changes the entire orientation of your prep. Mark your 3 peaks or your 2 peaks or whatever you think you're going to need. Hook in the first quarter of the session, complication at the midpoint, climax in the final quarter. They're placeholders for emotional weight. You're marking where things might need to matter in future. Now draw your valleys. 1 or 2 before the hook, you're establishing beat where the session finds its feet before it escalates. A rising slope from a 4 to a 6 between complication and crescendo, the slow build of your final act. Then assign scene types to each beat. Go back to your map and label each major beat with a scene type. Combat, roleplay, exploration, mystery, rest. You're building your orchestration now. 2 guidelines here. First, avoid 2 consecutive peaks using the same instrument. If your question peak is a combat encounter, maybe think about having your complication peak, maybe it's roleplay, confrontation, or a mystery revelation. Consecutive combat peaks might be fine depending on your campaign, but it also might train your players to process combat at a lower emotional register. Vary the instrument and the peaks feel like a distinct experience. Second, your deepest valley is a rest or low-stakes roleplay beat, a genuine exhale. Players at a campfire, a quiet moment in town. Then ask some questions. Look at each of your 3 peaks. Does each peak have a clear, dramatic question attached to it? Now let's talk about your valleys. How low is your deepest valley? If the lowest point in your session sits at a 4, your peaks could be compromised. Where is your genuine 0? And is it protected from the instinct to fill it? Now your beat cycles. For each of your major scenes, not just your peaks, write a brief note covering all 4 phases: action, consequence, reflection, anticipation. Single lines are just fine. Action, what happens? Consequence, what changes? Reflection, what you'll invite players to feel or express. Anticipation, what question opens at the scene's end to pull them forward. The reflection note is the one that some game masters skip over in prep because it feels unscriptable. And it is unscriptable in the sense that you can't write the player's response. What you can write is your invitation, a question you'll ask, a moment of stillness you'll protect, an NPC reaction that gives players permission to feel the weight of what just happened. Before moving on, write the invitation and then let players fill it. Then think about your ending. Before the session begins, make a conscious decision: resolution or cliffhanger. Base it on 3 factors. How emotionally heavy has the campaign been lately? Heavy campaigns need resolution endings more regularly. Where are you in the campaign arc? Mid-arc sessions can sustain cliffhangers more easily than sessions coming off a major story beat that needs to land fully. And honestly, how are your players doing? Not their characters, your players. If people have had a hard week, a resolution ending that sends them home with a sense of accomplishment does more for your table than a cliffhanger that sends them home with more anxiety. Decide before you sit down. Know which ending you're building toward. You can change it, of course, during the session if the live material demands it, but having a default means your final scene has a shape before it begins. Prep your 3 adjustments. For each of your 3 peaks, write one ready-made version of each adjustment. What does acceleration look like here? If this scene goes flat, what's the fastest way to raise stakes without breaking the fiction? An NPC arrival, a new thread, a time pressure that wasn't visible before. And you can write it down so you're not improvising under pressure when the table needs energy. What does holding look like here? If this scene needs to breathe after its peak, what's your invitation to the reflection phase? A question you'll ask, a pause you'll protect, a beat of stillness you'll create. You can write it so you can remember to reach for it instead of cutting away too fast. And what does a pivot look like here? If this scene loses structural footing entirely, what's your re-entry point? A world event, a new piece of information, a character moment that redirects without canceling what came before? Then, of course, run the session, then debrief yourself. After the session, take a few minutes to do this one thing. Go back to your map and draw what actually happened rather than what you planned. What the session's tension curve actually looked like based on your memory of the table's energy. Compare the 2 shapes. Where did players exceed your planned peaks? That's signal about what they care about. Where did the session flatline despite a planned peak? That's a signal about what isn't landing. Where did an unplanned valley open up that you didn't protect? You don't need to analyze this exhaustively, just a few minutes of honest reflection, one note about what to adjust for next session. Over time, the gap between your planned shape and your actual shape might get smaller because you become more fluent in reading them. That fluency is part of the craft, and it compounds. It all builds toward the kind of game mastering where the heartbeat model starts being a reflex. And that's your lecture for today, everyone. If this video gave you something useful, hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already, and share it with a game master that you think would find it useful. It genuinely helps the channel, and there's a lot more where this came from. Drop a comment below and tell me, what does your session tension curve usually look like? And as always, thanks for watching. See you next time.